Please be seated.
You want to be turning your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 8. That's the lesson comes from 10, but before we can get to chapter 10, we need to start in Leviticus chapter 8. And just one quick little thing I want to share with you. So every sermon, I've been doing this for the last, 3 years or so, but all my sermons, I build a folder. And you might see me bring the folder up here. Each sermon gets a folder. This contains a copy of my notes, a printout of the PowerPoint, any articles that I read that I thought were important, any notes I might have jotted down on a yellow sheet of paper go in here, any book that I read, chapter I read, anything and everything. Just if I listen to a podcast, it all gets written in here so that, hey, later on, if I wanted to preach on that subject again or somebody has a question, I can just pull this folder out and say, hey, that's where I got this. Well, in my folder, of course, is the PowerPoint and the notes, but I got and a bulletin. I always put a bulletin in there. I think that's just a good practice. I've got 2 articles, one that I printed off from one writer, and then one that I printed off. This is Matt's sermon, a sermon that Matt preached on Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's 2 sons, on February the 20th, 2017. Almost 8 years to the day, we got a sermon on this exact same chapter. I didn't plan it that way. I just happened to notice that at the top when I made sure that I had his article printed off. And so I think that's kind of cool. And I texted Lauren and I just let her know, hey, this is really cool. And she said it was. We often fixate on the tragic story of Nadab and Abihu. Their fiery demise in the tabernacle serves as a stark reminder of the holiness of God and the consequences of disobedience. In sermons and in lessons, we have dissected their actions, we have pondered their motivations, we've wrestled with what seemingly is the harsh judgment of God. But in the shadow of that dramatic event, there are 2 other figures. There are 2 other sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. And they too faltered. And they too deviated from the prescribed pattern. And yet they lived. Their story is often overlooked. But I think it offers for us kind of a nuanced perspective of God's judgment versus God's grace, God's severity versus God's kindness. And what I'd like for us to do tonight is work our way through Leviticus 10. And we're going to look at Aaron's 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, and Eleazar and Ithamar, and see what lessons that we can learn from both their actions in the tabernacle that day. Now, before we can get to Leviticus chapter 10, we need to look at the events leading up to it. They begin in Leviticus. If I say Luke, I mean Leviticus. I just follow the citations on the screen. Before we can get to Leviticus 10, we've got to start in Leviticus 8, because this is the consecration of Aaron and his 4 sons to serve as priests between God and the people. And I'm just going to highlight, we're just going to go through and just look at each one of those verses. There's a lot in between them, but what I want you to notice is that they are doing everything as the Lord commanded. Now we'll see a little bit of a change of that when we get to chapter 9. But notice everything that they do. Verse 4, and Moses did all that the Lord had commanded him. And then notice verse 9. And so Moses is going to set the turban on Aaron's head, and on the turban in front, he's going to set the gold plate and the holy crown of God. And he's going to do it as the Lord commanded Moses. Look over at verse 13. Moses is going to bring Aaron, the sons, and he's going to clothe them with coats and tie sashes around their waist and put on bound caps on them as the Lord had commanded. And then beginning with verse 14, we're going to have the bull and the sin offerings and all involved with that. And they're going to do it according to verse 17. It says, the bull and its skin and its flesh and its dung he burned up with the fire outside the camp as the Lord commanded Moses. Then they're going to bring a ram as a burnt offering. And they're going to do it in verse 21 as the Lord had commanded Moses. And then we're going to go through another sin or another animal sacrifice beginning with verse 22. Now notice verse 29. Moses is going to take the breast of and wave it as a wave offering before the Lord. It was Moses' portion of the ram ordinance as the Lord had commanded Moses. And then they're going to begin to anoint with the anointing oil and the blood of these sacrifices, the altar. And all of this ends with verse 36. And Aaron and his sons did all the things that the Lord commanded Moses. And we're not done. We move into chapter 9, and we're going to see this kind of this repetition again. Look with me at verse 5. And they brought what Moses had commanded to the front of the tent. Look with me at verse 10. But the fat and the kidneys and the long lobe of the liver for the sin offering, they burned it on the altar as the Lord had commanded Moses. Look with me at verse 16. After taking the people's sacrifice and offering, they presented the burnt offerings and offered it according to the rule, according to what God had commanded through Moses. Look with me at verse 21. After an ox and a ram offering, they take the breast and the right thigh, and it's waved as a wave offering before the Lord as Moses commanded. And so over and over again, what we see is as they're consecrating themselves to the Lord's service, they're doing it as the Lord commanded Moses. As they had the rule, they followed the rule, they followed the will of Moses, they followed the will of the Lord over and over and over again. And the result of this obedience was that the glory of God appeared to them. Stay with me and let's begin reading with verse 22. Then Aaron lifted up his hands towards the people and he blessed them. And he came down from offering the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offering. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. And when they came out, they blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the pieces of the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and they fell on their faces. If you've got your pencil, underline verse 24. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed. We're going to see that again in just a moment. And so all this obedience leads to God's glory appearing. And the fire is going to come out from before the Lord and consume the offering that the people have made through his priest for his worship. So we get to chapter 10. And all of this, following the pattern, is suddenly broken by Nadab and Abihu. Let's begin reading verse 1. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire. You might have a translation that says strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out before the Lord and consumed them. And they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified. And before all the people, I will be glorified." And Aaron held his peace. Have you ever been to a wedding that immediately kind of goes off script? As soon as the ring bearer and the flower girl are released, what happens? they go this way, they go that way, they just fall down, they lay down, they throw the, I mean, they do not do what they're supposed to do. And what do we do as the spectators or the participants? We just laugh, right? We laugh because it's funny, it's comical, it's a little relief in the moment. Nadab and Abihu are like the ring bearer and the flower girl, except what they do is not funny. They go off script, and they go off script the most tragic kind of way. They go and they grab their incense burners and they put the fire in it that they are supposed to bring to their part of the tabernacle. And they're not regarding God as holy. They are not regarding their task as sanctified. And this time the fire comes out from before the Lord and consumes them. Instead of consuming the sacrifice like it did in chapter 9, it consumes them. Instead of the people shouting and rejoicing before the Lord, it says, and Aaron held his peace. Nadab and Abihu died when they broke the pattern, when they did not do as they had been commanded to do. And then Moses has to speak up. And he's going to command Aaron and sons not to mourn. Let's pick the reading up with verse 4. And Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the son of Uziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said to them, come near, carry out your brothers from away from the front of the sanctuary and out of the camp. And so they came near and carried them in their coats out of the camp. And Moses said to Aaron and sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, do not let your hair of your heads hang loose. Do not tear your clothes, lest you die, and wrath come upon all the congregation. But let your brothers, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning that the Lord has kindled. Do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die. For the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses. If you got your pencil, there's a couple of things there that you might want to underline. He says to them, don't do this lest you die. In fact, he says it twice. Do not show any outward sign of mourning lest you die. Do not go out of the tabernacle unless you die. And then the third thing is, they did according to the word of Moses. Sometimes the question comes up, I mean, why would Moses tell Aaron, you cannot mourn your son? Well, it may be that what he is saying to them is, don't stop what you're doing and go and mourn. You have started the sin sacrifice. You have started your priestly duties. Do not neglect to keep doing what you are doing. Because if he was to take his hair down, which is kind of a way of disheveling himself, to show himself to be in mourning, he would have to take off the priestly robes that sanctified him as God's high priest. He would have to stop the worship before the Lord if he was to break out into weeping and mourning. And so you've started, don't stop. And maybe there's a second part of this that says, look, you have started, don't leave. We can't end the sacrifice in the middle of the sacrifice. We have to see it all the way through. And Aaron, it says, Aaron and Ithamar and Eleazar listened and did according to the word of Moses. But then there's more. See, Moses speaks, but now when we get to verse 8, God speaks. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, drink no wine or strong drink when you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever through your generations. You are to distinguish between holy and common, between unclean and clean. You are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to you or to them by Moses. And so basically what God's commanding them is, look, no drinking while you're on duty. Now we might say, why on earth would that even be in there? Well, a couple of reasons. One, it could be that Nadab and Abihu did what they did because they were inebriated. And so we have, as part of the ending or part of the narrative, God's going to say, don't do what they did. But then we might ask ourselves, did they bring it in their lunchbox? Well, you can go back, and I was told that this was part of the conversation in the Deuteronomy class on Wednesday night, but you can go back to Numbers 28, chapter 28, and you'll learn that wine was part of the drink offering, and strong drink was part of the drink offering. And you can read about it in Deuteronomy. That says chapter 4. I think that should be chapter 14. That when worshipers came, when they lived too far away and they're bringing their tithe offering, they could convert it into money and buy whatever their heart desires was, oxen, sheep, wine, and strong drink, and celebrate before the Lord. So it's there. It's just there. Now, when a worshiper would come and they would bring their grain offering, the priests were actually supposed to keep some of that for themselves and eat it. When a worshiper would bring certain animal sacrifices, they were actually supposed to keep some of that animal sacrifice for themselves, as we will see, and eat it. But unless I've missed it, nowhere are they told that they're allowed to keep some of the drink offering for themselves and drink it. And that may be something that's going on here. They've kept some of the drink offering for themselves. They have become inebriated. They don't know how to function and do their job. They are treating God as unholy. They are not treating the work as a sanctified work, and therefore God consumes them with His fire. And so Moses is going to make sure everyone is paying attention to what it is that they are supposed to be doing. And let's go back to Leviticus chapter 10. It's like I got 1 through 5 on there. I'm not sure why I did that. Let's go to verse 12. It should be verse 12 through 15. So Moses is going to speak to Aaron. So Nadab and Abihu have been consumed by the fire because they treated God as unholy. So then Moses is going to speak. Then God speaks. Now Moses is going to speak again. So Moses spoke to Aaron and to Eleazar and to Ithamar, his surviving sons. Take the grain offering that is left of the Lord's food offering and eat it unleavened beside the altar, for it is most holy. And you shall eat it in a holy place, because this is your due, and your sons' due, for the Lord's food offering. For so I am commanded. But the breast that is waved and the thigh that is contributed, you shall eat in a clean place, you and your sons and your daughters with you. For they are given as your due and your sons' due for the sacrifices of the peace offering and of the people of Israel. The thigh that it is contributed and the breast that is waved, they shall bring with the food offerings and the fat pieces to wave for a wave offering before the Lord, and it shall be yours and your sons with you to do, as a due forever, as the Lord has commanded. And so everything's kind of gone sideways. All the way up to this point, we have tried to do everything the Lord has commanded, and they've done it, and they've done it very successfully. But then Nadab and Abihu go off the rails, and it ain't funny, and the Lord consumes them. And so Moses is going to, I don't know if console Aaron is the right word, but at least he's going to say to Aaron, look, you've got a job, you and your son's got a job to do, and you've got to get your job done. And then God's going to give Aaron some kind of command, and Moses now is going to come back and kind of say, everyone take a deep breath. Remember what we're doing here. And he says to Aaron and the Eleazar and Ithamar, don't forget to eat your portion of the sacrifice. It is yours as the Lord has commanded. Now you can go back to Leviticus chapter 2 verses 1 through 16 or Leviticus chapter 7 verses 29 and 34. And you can kind of get from these different sacrifices how the priests not only were supposed to keep it as part of their due, but it's a part of the prescription for the way a sacrifice is supposed to be offered. The priest eats a part of it as the one who is offering it on behalf of the worshiper. That's what they're supposed to do. But what happens is Eleazar and Ithamar broke the pattern. They did not do what they were supposed to do, but they lived. Let's pick the reading up in verse 16. So after this, there must be some time has elapsed. Maybe not long, maybe an hour or two. But it says, now Moses diligently inquired about the goat of the sin offering, and behold, it was burned up. I consulted several different translations, and it's kind of interesting the way the translators approach different verses. Some translations here actually don't end the sentence with burned up. They just put a comma and they continue the rest of the verse as continuing the sentence. Some translations just put a period at the end of up, and some translations put an exclamation mark. And I really like the exclamation mark. He searched for it, but it was burned up. We've already had something burned up in this passage, and what was it? It was the two sons of Aaron. And now the sacrifice has been burned up, and Moses was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, the surviving sons of Aaron. Now Moses is going to speak beginning with verse 17, and I'm going to kind of put an angry tone on it as best I can. Why have you not eaten the sin offering in the place of the sanctuary, since it's the thing most holy and has been given to you, that you may bear the iniquity of the congregation and make atonement for them before the Lord? Behold, its blood was not brought into the inner part of the sanctuary. You certainly ought to have eaten it in the sanctuary. What? As I commanded. I know Moses is the meekest man, but he's furious. Why do you think he's furious? Well, what happened to the last two sons that broke the pattern? What happened to the last two sons that said, I'm not going to do it the way we're supposed to do it? They died. They were burned up. Now these two sons have let the sacrifice burn up instead of keeping some of it and eating it on behalf of the worshipers before the Lord. They have broken the pattern. And Moses is angry. I wonder, I know this is just wondering, does Moses have any backup sons? I mean, how is the high priesthood going to continue through Aaron if these are the only four sons he's got? Because the pattern's already been established. When you break the pattern, what happens? You die. And they have broken the pattern. Now, if you want more about the pattern, you can go to Leviticus chapter 6, it's verses 24 and 30, and you can get it over there. But Aaron then is going to interject, and I've put the word soberly in there. Because I do really think Nadab and Abihu were probably drunk. They were inebriated. But here is a breaking of the pattern that is done with sobriety of heart. And I've kind of summarized what he says, but let's read verse 19 first, and then we'll come back to my summary. And so Aaron then interjects. He said to Moses, behold, today they have offered their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord. And yet such things as these have happened to me. If I had eaten that sin offering today, would the Lord have approved? If Moses is angry, and that's the way we should read his words, then how do we read Aaron's? How do we read Aaron's words right there? Is it the words of a broken-hearted father who's telling their uncle, hey, you need to back off, buddy? Is it the words that are coming through a stiff upper lip? Because he's already been told, don't you cry, don't you weep, don't you mourn. because you're in God's holy place. You can do that after you leave here. And I think when we read these words sometimes, we need to make sure that we're putting the emotions into them that we already know exist. That while the words may be black and white on the paper, devoid of any kind of emotion, these were real people who were infused with emotion. And so if I can kind of summarize what Aaron is saying here is, it would be right outwardly, but it would be wrong inwardly. It would be right outwardly for me to go through the motions and for my sons to go through the motions and eat the sacrifice like we're supposed to. But we would not be considering God holy if we had done that. We would not be considering our work of being the priest of the people in a sanctified kind of way because our hearts would not be in it, Moses. Look at what has happened to us today. And you know, this isn't the only place we see something like this. I want to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 30, and I want to look at, don't go there yet. I want to look at Hezekiah's keeping of the Passover, but before we go there, we need to go to Numbers chapter 9 to establish the pattern and the rule. Numbers chapter 9. So beginning with verse 1, here is what we read. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year that they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the people of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month at twilight, you shall keep it at its appointed time. According to all its statutes and its rules, you shall keep it. We've already established this whole do everything as God has commanded it. So, verse 4, Moses told the people of Israel that they should keep the Passover. And they kept the Passover in the first month on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all the Lord had commanded Moses. So the people of Israel did. And there were certain men who were unclean through touching a dead body, so that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And so they came before Moses and before Aaron, and these men said to them, we are unclean through touching a dead body. Why are we kept from bringing the Lord's offering as its appointed time among the people of Israel? And Moses said to them, that's a really good question. Wait, that I may hear what the Lord will command concerning you. So verse 9, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, if any of you or of your descendants is unclean through touching a dead body, or is on a long journey, he shall keep the Passover to the Lord in the second month, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any of its bones, according to all the statutes for the Passover, they shall keep it. And then we get verse 13. Unless anyone abuse the exceptions, we learn this. But if anyone who is clean and is not on a journey fails to keep the Passover, that person shall be cut off from his people because he did not bring the Lord's offering at its appointed time. That man shall bear his sin. So there are exceptions. If you have a relative that dies and you are in presence with that dead body and you prepared that body and you helped bury that body, now you're unclean, you can't keep the Passover, hey, you're excused, wait until next month. If you were on a long journey and you couldn't make it back in time, you know what? You're excused. You can keep it the next month. But if neither one of those cases apply to you, you are expected to keep it, and if you don't, you're going to be cut off from your people. Now let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 30. 2 Chronicles chapter 30. This is in the reign of Hezekiah. we're going to pay particular attention to verses 17, but I guess I'll start reading the first part of the chapter and then we'll skip down. So Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh. So he sent a letter to all of Israel and Judah, so the northern tribes and southern tribes, and wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should come to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem to keep the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel. For the king and his princes, all the assembly of Jerusalem had taken counsel to keep the Passover in the second month. For they could not keep it at that time, because the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient number, nor had the people assembled in Jerusalem. And the plan seemed right to the king and to all the assembly. So they decreed to make a proclamation throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, so from the south to the north, that the people should come and keep the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel, at Jerusalem. For they had not kept it as often as prescribed. So couriers went throughout all Israel and Judea with letters from the kings and his princes. And the king had commanded, saying, O people of Israel, return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that he may turn again to the remnant of you who have escaped from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your fathers or your brothers who were faithless to the Lord of their father, so that he made them a desolation as you see. Do not now be stiff-necked as your fathers were, but yield yourselves to the Lord and to come to his sanctuary. For he has consecrated forever to serve the Lord your God, that his fierce anger may be turned away from you. For if you return to the Lord, your brothers and your children will find compassion with their captors and return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful and will not turn away his face from you if you return to him. And so we read, beginning with verse 10, that the couriers had gone throughout all the land. However, they come to Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun, and people laughed at them, except there were some in Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun who humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. Now let's pick it up with verse 17. For there were many in the congregation, or the assembly, who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levites had to slaughter the Passover lamb for everyone who was not clean, to consecrate it to the Lord. For a majority of the people, many of them from Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves. Yet they ate the Passover otherwise than as prescribed. For Hezekiah had prayed for them, saying, May the good Lord pardon everyone who sets his heart to seek the Lord, the God of his fathers, even though not according to the sanctuary's rules for cleanness. And the Lord heard Hezekiah, and he healed the people. And basically what we're doing is we're taking what we're reading about in Leviticus chapter 19 and what Aaron says, I could do it right outwardly, but it would be wrong inwardly, and we're just flipping it on its head. What's happening in the days of Hezekiah is all these people have come and they're doing it wrong outwardly, but they're doing it right inwardly. They have to have the priest to slaughter their own Passover lamb. That was the worshiper's job. That is what they were supposed to do. Because they're not clean. They have not prepared themselves. Let alone the fact that they're not even keeping the Passover on the prescribed day because nobody had bothered to even do it. What was the rule back in Numbers chapter 9? If you can keep it and you don't keep it, you are to be cut off from your people. And they didn't keep it. They just said, you know what, we'll just do it the second day. That's when we can do it, and that's when we're going to do it. And in both accounts, whether it's the account from 2 Chronicles or it's the account from Leviticus chapter 10, when the reason for this is given, I'm going back to Leviticus 10, it says, And Moses heard what Aaron said, and He approved. So why did two sons die, but two sons live when they both broke God's pattern? That's the question that we've got to answer from Leviticus 10. It's not enough for us to come to a passage like this and preach Nadab and Abihu and stop there. We have to finish the narrative. We have to see what happens to the other two sons. And then we have to grapple with this question. Why did two die, two live, and yet both broke God's pattern? I think the answer can be found in Romans chapter 11. Let's go over there. When Micah saw this slide, he said, there's no words, it's messed up. The words will come in just a moment. Just hang on. I want to read the verse first. Romans chapter 11. Now, in this section of Romans, Paul is speaking to Gentiles, and he's talking about Jew-Gentile relationship. And the way he is talking about this relationship is through horticulture, primarily through the olive tree. Domesticated olive tree, wild olive tree. He's talking about grafting and pruning. Some Jews, because of unbelief, have been pruned off, but Gentiles through faith have been grafted in. And so he's going to say to them, look, just because you've been grafted in, don't lord it over the unbelieving Jew, because you can be cut off just like they were. And kind of the summation of all this is Romans chapter 11, and it's verse 22. He says, note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in His kindness. Behold, the severity and the kindness, or the kindness and the severity of God. And I would submit to you that Nadab and Abihu, they were recipients of God's severity because they ignored God's holiness and they fell before Him. They approached God with unbelief. They approached God with a lack of regard for His holiness. They didn't care what they were going to give God. They just went and did it anyway. But why did the second two brothers, Eleazar and Ithamar, live? Why did they live? Because I would submit to you, because they trusted in God's kindness. And consequently, they lived. They were supposed to eat that sacrifice. But they knew I could go through the motions, but my heart wouldn't be in it. And that would be just as sinful as my two brothers who died just a moment ago. And so they choose to not violate God's command actively. I guess you could say they did it passively by letting it burn up. And in that way, they regarded God as holy. The story of Aaron's sons is a powerful lesson in this delicate balance between God's kindness and God's severity. The fiery death of Nadab and Abihu serves as a stark warning, a reminder of the profound reverence that is due our Creator. The story underscores the seriousness of approaching God with anything less than complete obedience and a heart attuned to His will. But the narrative didn't end there, because the actions of Eleazar and Ithamar, while not in strict adherence to the prescribed ritual, offered a different perspective. Perhaps driven by grief, But certainly driven by a profound reverence for God's holiness, they deviated from the established pattern and they did not eat the sacrifice. And their actions challenges us to consider the complexities of faith. The tension between obedience to the letter of the law and the intent of the law. We may not always fully grasp the reason behind God's judgments. We may struggle to reconcile His holiness with His love. But what we can know and what we must cling to is the unwavering truth of His character. Behold, the kindness and severity of our God. Severity to those who fall in unbelief, but kindness to those who establish themselves, trust themselves in His goodness, His mercy, and His grace. We have a song of encouragement. Can we help you with something this evening? Won't you come while together we stand and sing?